never forget hearing Monteverdi's music for the first time. I suppose I must have been about 7 or 8 when my parents took me to the local summer school of music at Bryanston in Dorset, where we lived. Nadia Boulanger was there. She was later to become my teacher, and she was directing a keen group of amateur singers in madrigals by Monteverdi. But I first heard his Vespers sometime in the mid-1950s. It was broadcast from York Minster with Walter Gurr conducting, and we taped it and played it over and over again. I suppose it was then that I was exposed for the first time to the explosive power of his music. I was enthralled. Surely this was some of the most eloquent music ever written. I first conducted the Vespers when I was a student at Cambridge. In those days, pretty well no one there had even heard of the piece. But the whole undertaking of putting it all together, of coming to terms with this extraordinary work, literally changed the course of my life. Instead of becoming a historian, I went on to study music, formed the Monteverdi choir, and became a professional conductor. The odd thing is that while I've conducted so much other music over the last 25 years, from Rameau to Lutosławski and Bach to Bartók, I always feel a sense of joy coming home to Monteverdi. Above all, his Vespers have been a kind of talisman to me, and performances of the work have punctuated different stages of my career. At the proms, in a whole range of English and French cathedrals, and most recently in Italy. The music fits here. The light's right, the setting is perfect, the buildings are marvelous, the acoustics are excellent. So that coming to Venice, and to the islands and to the lagoon, where Monteverdi worked for 30 years, it's like a pilgrimage, bringing Monteverdi's music back to its source. So who was Monteverdi? He was one of the first composers one can really get to know as a man, because he left so many letters, and we have the portraits showing that rather gaunt, El Greco-like, ascetic face with its penetrating gaze. He seems to have been a bit vain, liked being appreciated and hated having to queue up for his paycheck. At Mantua, where he was employed for 20 years before coming to Venice, he was pretty miserable, overworked and underpaid, jealous of most other composers, and at the mercy of his employer's whims, the Gonzaga family, the Dukes of Mantua. Yet the fact remains that he wrote some of his most prodigious music there. 3 volumes of madrigals, magnificent music on a miniature scale, but of colossal intensity and power. Then there was a 1-act ballet and 2 full-length operas, Feo and Ariana. Feo was a stunning achievement. You could call it the first opera worthy of that name in the history of music. And the Vespers music, composed around the same time, is its twin. All that took place in Mantua, but it was in Venice that Monteverdi lived and worked for the last 30 years of his life. And it's here, in the church of I Frari, that he is buried. Such a plain, modest tombstone for the greatest of all composers in Venice before Vivaldi. So what was the connection between Venice and the Vespers? We know that he moved here in 1613, but that he must have written the music at least 3 years before. Even so, no amount of digging away at the sources has ever come up with a commission or a first performance in Mantua. So what are the facts? First, that Monteverdi was deeply unhappy in Mantua and was looking for a job elsewhere. Then, he'd had a double bereavement. First his wife died, and then the young singer who lived with them, almost as a daughter, and who should have starred in his second opera, Ariana, she also died in 1608. Thirdly, he'd had the Vespers music published with a Venetian printer. While there's nothing especially significant about that, it does indicate that Monteverdi was keen to display his wares here. The most famous composer of secular music in Italy had suddenly come up with a major piece of church music. And this just at a time when the procurators of St. Mark's were on the lookout for a new choirmaster, or maestro di capella, the top job for a church musician in all Italy. I feel that whatever else may have triggered Monteverdi into composing the Vespers, it was intended by him as a kind of promotional portfolio, a job application advertising his extraordinary gifts and his suitability for the job of maestro di capella at St. Mark's. And the fact that he got the job shows that the procurators of St. Mark's knew a work of genius when they saw one. But it also shows that Monteverdi may well have slanted the work to suit Venice's unique culture and traditions. He even dedicated it to the Blessed Virgin, who is especially venerated here. For many Venetians, the true patron saint of the city was not St. Mark, but the Blessed Virgin herself. Merchants believed that the city was founded on the Feast of the Annunciation, and Venetians looked to Mary not only as Holy Mother, but also as their special guardian protecting them against disease, invaders, and the dangers of the sea. She was the Stella Maris, the star of the seas. A typically Venetian theme, not lost on Monteverdi. Getting the job at St. Mark's wasn't all plain sailing. To clinch it, Monteverdi had to pass an audition, or prova, and part of it seems to have taken place here on this island in Palladio's great church, San Giorgio Maggiore. We know this because the account books for St. Mark's show that 2 wooden chamber organs had to be shipped here and back, specially from the basilica. Interesting that it should have taken place here, just at the point where you get the full, unique impact of Venice rising out of the sea. Tom Coriat, the Somerset man who came here in 1608, got it right when he wrote, "I saw Venice, which yielded the most glorious and heavenly show upon the water that ever any mortal eye beheld." That's, of course, the miracle of Venice, the fact that it's built on the sea. And this fact was commemorated each year on Ascension Day at the ceremony of the marriage of Venice to the sea. And the Doge would throw a wedding ring symbolically into the waters. At the very heart of the Vespers, Monteverdi sets a text which refers to the Virgin as Porta Orientalis, portal of the sunrise. But this description was also applied to Venice itself. Porta Orientalis, gateway to the east. It was from this city, more than from any other, that traders and buccaneers set out for the Levant. To Constantinople, to Egypt, and to Syria. And adventurers like Marco Polo went, of course, far further east. Trade was the basis of Venice's power, and it was the Venetians who cynically deflected the Fourth Crusade away from the Holy Land and towards Byzantium, ransacked the city, and brought back unbelievable treasures. Lots of them built into or stuck onto St. Mark's itself. Right up to Monteverdi's time in Venice, the gateway to the Muslim East remained open, and there was a constant coming and going of ambassadors, merchants, and even musicians. A look at the title page of the 1610 publication tells us a lot about Monteverdi's intentions. The first thing to notice is that there are 2 pieces of church music published in the same volume. Besides the famous Vespers, there's a setting of the Mass. Much the biggest typeface is kept for the dedication to the Most Holy Virgin. Then comes the Mass for 6 voices. This was a reactionary, ultra-conservative piece that cost Monteverdi an awful lot of sweat and tears on his own admission, and was clearly slanted towards Rome, which was probably about the only other place in Italy which could have provided him the forces and the prestige and the security he was looking for. So it's logical that the volume was dedicated to the Pope, Paul V. Monteverdi was hedging his bets. Next come the Vespers. For larger forces, it says, ideal for St. Mark's, with its famous tradition of double choir psalm singing and its new band of wind players. And then come the jokers in the pack. Non nullis sacris concentibus, a few sacred concertos said to be suitable for the chapels or the chambers of princes. On the face of it, they look like detachable separate pieces, and certainly their scale is much, much smaller than any of the rest of the music. Perhaps it was music he tried out in Mantua, very modern and very secular. but the title page doesn't tell you everything. These are photocopies of the original part books, and it's only when you get to the very back of the organ part that you find an index showing the order of service. Here are the 5 Vesper Psalms for the Feasts of the Blessed Virgin, the hymn, and 2 alternative settings of the Magnificat. This is flamboyant music on the grandest scale, but sandwiched between the psalm settings, Monteverdi has inserted his jokers, solo numbers for 1, 2, or 3 voices. This intimate music, chamber music really, is in bold contrast to the public statements of the Psalms. 3 out of 5 of these intruders are virtually love songs. Rome would never have tolerated this, but there's evidence to suggest that in Venice, with its tradition of independence and free thinking, he could just about get away with it. Ravishing and voluptuous. But can we really call this church music? It's stretching the term a bit. The text comes from the Song of Songs, the most erotic book of the Old Testament. And the idea is that all the sensuous stuff about the beloved is legitimized as worship of the Holy Virgin, rather in the same way that a painter like Veronese picked quite indiscriminately the prettiest girls as models for his portraits of Juno, Venus, or the Madonna. Monteverdi was breaking new ground. This intermixture of sacred and secular is just one of the many original features of the Vespers. If you remove the solo motets and reinstate the plain song, and if you reshuffle the published order as has become the fashion recently, you upset, I believe, Monteverdi's brilliantly symmetrical structure. Of course, individual movements can stand on their own, but then you lose the satisfying proportions of his own printed sequence. No one before had composed in such a dazzling variety of styles. No one had written church music on this scale before. It took a genius like Monteverdi to embrace all these contrasts of mood and style and to project a work lasting 90 minutes in almost architectural terms. And that's why St. Mark's Basilica seems to me the perfect setting for a Vespers performance. A place where the richness of both eye and ear can be satisfied. Nobody, I suppose, can ever forget their first view of St. Mark's, that incredible wedding cake of a church, with its hugely ornate facade, marble everywhere, and the mosaics on the floors and on the ceilings, and the cupolas encrusted with jewels, more a temple than a church. Well, imagine what it must have been like in Monteverdi's day, the colours even more vivid than they are today, the marble whiter, the mosaics even sharper, the golds more burnished, the whole place swathed with drapes, tapestries, and oriental carpets. Especially when the Doge came to church, because St. Mark's was his private chapel, as well as being the religious and political focal point for the whole city. 14 times a year, there were tremendous ceremonies here, with processions starting here in the Doge's palace and going all the way around the piazza. First of all would come the clergy in their robes, and then the ambassadors and the papal nuncio, and all the visiting dignitaries in their splendid finery, and then the Doge himself with his ermine tippet and his crimson shoes and that extraordinary golden cap that he wore, and preceded, as wherever he went in the city, by his special 6 silver trumpeters. You can imagine the whole city would be there. The crowds staring from the porticos in the square, leaning out of their windows, even climbing onto the roofs if they could find a way up. The bells of the great campanile would be rung, and the whole procession would go round the great square to enter St. Mark's by its west door. The first thing the crowd would see, though right in the distance and beyond the high altar, was the Pala d'Oro, a huge screen of gold and jewels, the most exotic and precious Byzantine treasure in St. Mark's. It was only swiveled round to face the public on those occasions when the Doge came to church. If he was a newly elected Doge, he was presented to the people from the right-hand pulpit, a curious hexagonal bigonzo, literally a tub, that was stolen by the Venetians from Constantinople. But on other state occasions, the musicians would sing from there, but they would be turned towards the high altar where the Doge and the senators would be seated in the chancel. On the opposite side is another double-decker pulpit, under an onion-shaped canopy of bronze and marble, very Islamic in looks. It's features like this that makes one feel just how oriental St. Mark's is. Max Beerbohm compared the building to an Eastern garden that had by some Christian miracle petrified just when the flowers were fading. A garden where Muhammad had walked, and his spirit walks there yet. I feel that there's some of that spirit in Monteverdi's Vespers. But were the Vespers performed here in St. Marco sometime in Monteverdi's lifetime? We simply can't be sure. But it seems almost impossible to believe that they weren't. For example, back in 1613, at the time of his audition here, we know that he performed a piece of his own music involving an orchestra of around 30 players and a choir of about the same size. And what more appropriate than the Vespers recently published here? And then again, the procurators, in confirming him for the job as maestro here, referred to printed music of his that had been performed by the choir of St. Mark's here to their total satisfaction. It seems almost as if the Vespers really belonged here. And one can imagine Monteverdi exploiting the acoustics of this wonderful building, this natural theatre with its galleries and its arcades and its opportunities for dramatic exchanges between singers and echo effects. And the acoustics are incredibly pure. The sounds go right to the end with a complete smoothness and utter beauty.
So, just how would the musicians have been deployed in St. Mark's? The evidence is contradictory. One contemporary painting shows the Doge in his private chapel, as it were, in front of the Pala d'Oro, the senators in the choir stalls, and the solo singers and instrumentalists arranged in various tiered balconies above. They would, of course, have been hidden from the congregation in the nave, the source of their sounds, in typical Baroque fashion, always a bit of a surprise. But where would the performers have been positioned on other major church festivals?
It used to be thought that the choir sang from the two organ galleries behind me, but in fact it's much more likely that they sang either from the tub, the bigonzo, or from the double-decker pulpit on my right. But on special occasions they sang from the center of the church, as for instance when 4 Japanese princes came here in 1585. Then they erected 2 special rostra here in the center of the church. And that's exactly what we've done for our performance, because this too is a special occasion, a recreation of Monteverdi's Vespers of 1610 here in the Basilica, the very building that may well have inspired its composition.